I would marry you when I grow up. Take this ribbon.
When I grow up, I'll marry you. The little girl pushed a ribbon into his scarred hand, her voice steady despite the horror on every adult face around them. He was 10 years old, his skin still raw from the fire that had stolen half his face. And she looked at him like he was beautiful. Her mother ripped her away, screaming. The boy kept that ribbon for 18 years. What he didn't know was that the girl never stopped looking for him. And when she finally found him again, a reclusive duke hiding in the shadows of his own estate, she had no intention of letting him go. This is The Duke's Revenge. I'm here with stories that prove sometimes the most powerful men are brought to their knees by the women they thought they'd lost forever. Tell me in the comments, where are you watching from right now, and what's your local time? I love knowing this community stretches across the world, all of us hungry for the same thing. Stories where love doesn't just happen, it conquers.
Tonight, we're going back to 1835 England, to a garden party where a 6-year-old girl made a promise that would haunt 2 lives for nearly 2 decades. To a duke so feared that grown men crossed the street to avoid him, whose scarred face hid the coldest, most calculating mind in English aristocracy. And to the woman who walked back into his life as an artist hired to paint his portrait, never telling him she'd been searching for him since the day her mother tore her away. They said she was mad to chase a childhood memory. They said the Duke of Winterbourne would never let anyone close enough to see his face, let alone his heart. They had no idea that once Sebastian claimed something as his, he never let it go. And Eliza had made herself his the moment she pushed that ribbon into his hand. Let me take you back to that summer afternoon in 1835, where everything began. The garden party at Hartley Manor stretched across manicured lawns where privilege disguised itself as leisure, the afternoon sun gilding everything it touched, while servants moved like ghosts between guests who pretended not to see them. Eliza Hartwell, 6 years old and imprisoned in white muslin her mother insisted must remain spotless, watched the other children play their supervised games with the kind of careful boredom that comes from being told what fun looks like, rather than being allowed to discover it. 3 warnings about grass stains, 2 about volume, 1 about unladylike running. The mathematics of childhood restriction had driven her away from the crowd toward the garden's wilder edges, where adult attention grew thin. She found him beneath an ancient oak, a boy hunched on a stone bench as though trying to disappear into the weathered granite. Even at a distance, she could see the bandages wrapping his head and neck, the way he held himself like something broken that might shatter if jostled. The other children had been warned away with words like "quote 1" and "quote 2", spoken in voices that dripped false sympathy over genuine revulsion. She'd heard the adults whispering about fire and surgeries, and how the youngest Winterbourne son would never be presentable in society, each word landing like a small stone thrown at something already wounded. Eliza approached him the way she imagined approaching a wounded bird, slowly, without threat, driven by a curiosity that hadn't yet learned to manifest as fear. He didn't acknowledge her presence, even when she settled beside him on the bench, her dress pooling like spilled cream. Up close, she could see burn scars creeping from beneath bandages, mottled tissue in reds and whites that looked angry despite weeks of healing. His hands bore matching damage, tight, shiny skin across knuckles, where grafts had been attempted with limited success. He was fighting tears, jaw locked tight enough she could see the muscle jumping, breath controlled in that particular way that means someone is holding back an ocean. "Does it hurt?" she asked it simply, the way children do before they learn that some truths are meant to be wrapped in euphemism. He flinched, but didn't answer. Eliza pulled a ribbon from her pocket, pale blue silk she'd been saving for something undefined but important. She held it out, waiting until he reluctantly turned enough to see the offering.
My mama says pretty things help when you're sad. You can keep it. I want you to have it. Sebastian, though she didn't know his name yet, didn't know he was nobility, knew only that he sat alone and hurting, and that seemed wrong. Stared at the ribbon as though she'd offered him the moon. His fingers closed around it with the care of someone handling something precious and impossibly fragile. When he finally looked at her directly, his right eye held such naked hope and disbelief that it made her chest ache in ways she was too young to name. No one had looked at him since the fire. No one had touched him voluntarily. No one had offered anything except pity, carefully maintained at arm's length. And here was this girl, in her perfect dress, sitting beside him as though his appearance was ordinary, gifting him silk and speaking to him like he remained human, rather than tragedy.
"When I grow up, I'll marry you," Eliza announced, with the absolute certainty children possess before the world teaches them doubt. She said it the way another child might declare their intention to become a queen or tame dragons, except her voice carried conviction rather than fantasy, promise rather than wish. His expression shifted, not quite a smile because burned tissue made that difficult, but a softening that suggested the same emotional territory. He opened his mouth to respond, to say thank you or why or please don't promise impossible things, but her mother's voice cut across the garden like a blade, sharp with panic and fury. "Eliza! Eliza, get away from him! Don't touch that! Come here this instant!" Her mother materialized at the garden's edge, face flushed with embarrassment, and something darker. The other guests turned to stare as the Hartwell child sat beside the burned Winterbourne boy, touching him, speaking to him as though he wasn't something to hide and whisper about.
Her mother closed the distance in seconds, fingers clamping around Eliza's arm hard enough to bruise beneath the muslin, yanking her backward with violence that had nothing to do with discipline and everything to do with social catastrophe. The sentence died incomplete, too many competing priorities fighting for voice. She dragged Eliza toward the main party, grip bruising, expression promising consequences later when witnesses weren't present. Eliza twisted back, reaching for Sebastian with her free hand, child's face crumpling with confused tears, because she didn't understand why kindness warranted punishment, why helping someone in pain was wrong. Sebastian sat frozen, blue ribbon clutched in his damaged hand, watching the girl in the white dress being pulled away as though he carried contagion. Her mother's voice echoed across the garden, scolding about touching him, speaking to him, treating him like he was normal when clearly he wasn't, and never would be again. Other children stared, their faces reflecting the pity and revulsion he'd seen in every mirror since the flames. Adults looked away or through him, carefully neutral expressions that meant they worked very hard not to show disgust. He studied the ribbon, this small, perfect thing she'd given him, and something inside him hardened in that moment. Not broke, but calcified, transforming from soft, vulnerable hope into something cold and unyielding as iron. If this was how the world operated, he would master its rules. If people feared him anyway, if they saw monsters regardless of his actions, perhaps there was power in accepting that role rather than fighting it. He kept the ribbon, tucked it where no one would find it, where he could remember briefly what it felt like when someone looked at him and saw a person worth making promises to. But he also kept the lessons that day taught, that discomfort could be weaponized, that fear was more reliable than affection, that the world respected power and crushed weakness without mercy. 18 years transformed that burned child into someone far more dangerous than the world suspected. By 1853, Sebastian Winterbourne, Duke of Winterbourne, had built an empire not despite his isolation, but because of it.
His scars had become tools. Hold someone's gaze too long and watch them capitulate in negotiations. Turn his damaged profile toward rivals and observe their confidence crumble. While his brothers had played at politics and business, Sebastian had studied both with the focused intensity of someone who understood he needed every possible advantage to survive in a world that had already judged him unacceptable. His eldest brother died in 1848. The second followed 3 years later. Suddenly, Sebastian was Duke at 26, unwanted, unexpected, and far more competent than anyone anticipated. The estate lawyers were relieved when he announced his intention to manage affairs primarily through correspondence rather than taking active roles in London society. They believed the scarred Duke would hide away and cause no trouble. They were catastrophically wrong. By October 1853, Sebastian's reputation extended far beyond physical appearance. Yes, he was reclusive and scarred and rarely seen in public. But among those who dealt with the Winterbourne estate, business partners, politicians, tenants, rivals, he was known as brilliant, ruthless, and utterly unforgiving of incompetence or betrayal. There were stories whispered in London clubs about men who'd tried to cheat him and found themselves bankrupted within months, their reputations destroyed so thoroughly they couldn't secure credit anywhere. About rivals who'd mocked his appearance and discovered damaging scandals appearing in newspapers, their careers imploding publicly and spectacularly. About competitors who'd attempted to undercut Winterbourne investments, only to learn Sebastian had anticipated their moves 3 steps ahead, using their own strategies against them. His staff at Winterbourne Hall maintained absolute discretion, not just from fear, but from loyalty. He paid well, listened to advice, rewarded competence generously, and protected his people as ruthlessly as he destroyed his enemies. The downstairs whispers acknowledged he was terrifying but fair, that crossing him was suicide, but serving him well meant security and respect most aristocratic households never offered. Sebastian himself chose isolation strategically rather than shamefully. People who never saw him built him up in imagination into something more fearsome than reality, and that fear proved useful. People who did see him were so focused on managing their reactions to his scars that they revealed far more than they intended. And people who dismissed him as tragic learned very quickly that the Duke of Winterbourne had no interest in sympathy and considerable interest in making them regret their condescension. He lived in controlled solitude, rising early for estate work, walking the grounds when unlikely to encounter anyone, spending evenings reading or reviewing correspondence. No friends, no companions, no one who would miss him if he disappeared. He'd made peace with this reality because the alternative, enduring the exhausting performance of social interaction, the stares and whispers and barely concealed horror, offered no benefit justifying the cost. The little girl with the ribbon had been buried so deep he'd convinced himself she was forgotten. The memory surfaced occasionally late at night when sleep proved elusive, wondering what became of her, whether she'd grown into someone who kept childhood promises or learned to see the world like her mother did, whether she'd married someone appropriate, someone whose face didn't make children cry, whether she even remembered him, or if that garden encounter had been as forgettable to her as it was formative to him. But these were thoughts for dark, solitary moments, serving no useful purpose. He'd accepted his category in the world's division, people who could have normal lives and people who couldn't. More importantly, he'd built power and influence, meaning no one could hurt him the way that girl's mother had, that he controlled every interaction's terms and could destroy anyone who tried to make him feel small. Which made it surprising when his estate manager Harrison appeared that October morning, announcing an artist had arrived from London
with a commission from the Historical Estates Society to paint portraits documenting Winterbourne Hall and its current master. Sebastian looked up from account books, expressions settling into what Harrison privately called the negotiation face. Blank, unreadable, cold enough to make grown men reconsider their words. He hadn't sat for portraits since before the fire, had refused several society attempts to include Winterbourne in documentation projects. The idea of someone studying his face for hours was so profoundly unappealing. His first instinct was to send the artist back to London immediately, with generous payment for wasted time, and a notation that the Historical Society was permanently banned from Winterbourne property. "I didn't commission any portraits," Sebastian said, voice carrying the roughness that came from disuse. "And I explicitly declined previous requests. Who authorized this?" Harrison explained quickly. A junior secretary had responded without understanding it required the Duke's personal approval. The artist had arrived with legitimate documentation and already begun setting up in the East Gallery. He'd only just learned of the situation himself. Sebastian considered his options with characteristic calculation. Refusing would require explanations revealing exactly why he found portrait sitting objectionable, generating the pity and speculation he'd spent years avoiding. Moreover, refusing the Historical Society would draw attention, create gossip about why the Duke opposed documentation, invite scrutiny he preferred to avoid. Easier to simply endure it. Add this to the long list of strategic inconveniences required by managing his public reputation. "Quote 10, he said, the word clipped and arctic. Harrison withdrew, visibly relieved. Sebastian returned to his accounts, determinedly not thinking about sitting still while someone studied his face in detail, even doctors avoided when possible. About the inevitable moment when the artist would see him clearly and work very hard to maintain professional composure. He lasted 6 hours before strategic curiosity overwhelmed habitual caution, and he found himself walking toward the East Gallery, telling himself this was reconnaissance, gathering information to better control the situation. The gallery occupied the second floor, a long room with tall south-facing windows, walls covered in portraits of previous dukes, all handsome, whole, unmarred by the kind of damage that made people uncomfortable. Sebastian approached quietly, years of preferring to observe before announcing himself, and paused in the doorway to assess the situation. An easel stood near the windows, supplies arranged with professional precision, and a young woman with her back to him studied the existing portraits with focused intensity, suggesting she was already planning her approach. She was small, perhaps 5'4", with dark hair pinned practically rather than fashionably, wearing a simple gray dress showing paint stains along sleeves and hem. Her posture radiated confidence, comfort in her own body, unself-conscious about occupying space. Sebastian catalogued these details with the attention he usually reserved for business negotiations. She reached up to adjust the easel, movement pulling her dress taut, and he realized with mild surprise she was younger than expected, mid-20s perhaps, which seemed impossibly young for Historical Society commissions. Most of their documentation artists were older men with decades of experience. A young woman taking this work was unusual enough to make him recalculate assumptions about what kind of artist he was dealing with. She said without turning, voice carrying with clear, educated diction. Phrased as question but delivered as statement, professional certainty from knowing her expertise exceeded his in this domain. Sebastian felt his assessment shift. This wasn't someone easily intimidated or managed, someone who'd defer to his title or wishes if they conflicted with her professional standards. He cleared his throat deliberately, the sound rough in the quiet gallery. The woman turned to face him. Her face held delicate English beauty, pale skin, dark eyes radiating remarkable intensity, features suggesting intelligence and determination. She looked at him for a long moment, gaze traveling over his face with careful attention that usually preceded pity or revulsion. Sebastian braced for the inevitable reaction. Slight eye-widening, involuntary backward step, struggled to maintain composure while clearly wanting to look anywhere else. The expected reaction never came. Instead, she held his gaze steadily, expression shifting into something resembling recognition, though that made no sense because Sebastian was certain he'd never met this woman.
"Your Grace," she said, dropping into a curtsy that was technically correct, but somehow conveyed mockery of the formality, as though she performed required social dance while simultaneously suggesting she found aristocratic protocol somewhat ridiculous.
"I'm Eliza Hartwell. I'll be painting your portrait over the next several weeks. I was told you preferred minimal sessions, which is fine. I work quickly when necessary. But I'll need at least 3 full sittings to capture proper detail, 6 if you can spare the time. Preliminary architectural studies I can manage independently, but the formal portrait requires your cooperation." Her voice remained steady, professional, giving no indication his appearance affected her beyond normal assessment an artist might make of a subject's features and how best to render them. Sebastian found himself wrong-footed by the complete absence of expected reaction, by the way she looked at him with the same focused professionalism she directed at historical portraits, interested, analytical, but without visible discomfort. Most people, upon first seeing him, clearly struggled with eye contact. They looked at scars, away, back again in that peculiar dance of morbid curiosity and social propriety, discomfort so obvious it might as well be announced. This woman, Eliza Hartwell, looked at him like she might look at any subject she intended to paint, with professional assessment and careful attention, but none of the usual reactions making social interactions so exhausting.
"Miss Hartwell," he managed, voice rougher than intended. "I wasn't aware we'd agreed beyond a single formal portrait. The commission, as I understand it, is for estate documentation, not an extended personal portrait series." He kept his tone cold, businesslike, establishing boundaries before she developed expectations exceeding what he'd provide. Eliza smiled, quick expression transforming her entire face in ways tugging at something in his memory. Something familiar in her mouth's shape, her gaze's directness, the complete lack of fear in his presence that was so rare he should definitely remember if he'd encountered it before. She explained quickly, words efficient and matter-of-fact. The Society's commission was comprehensive, not just formal portraiture, but contextual documentation, including the Duke as central figure, surrounded by architectural studies, collection details, historical artifacts defining Winterbourne's legacy. She'd need grounds access for landscape work, library access for detail studies, and yes, multiple sittings because a single session would produce only surface representation, rather than substantive documentation the Society required and her professional reputation demanded. The way she said this last part suggested her professional reputation mattered considerably more than his preferences about portrait sitting hours, and Sebastian found himself almost amused by her complete lack of deference to his title or obvious desire to minimize this situation. He said, making it sound like concession, though they both knew he was agreeing to her minimum requirement. Eliza considered this, head tilted slightly as though calculating whether 3 sessions would truly suffice or whether she'd need to negotiate for more later. Then she nodded once, briskly, accepting terms as offered.
"That will work,"
she said, though her tone suggested she reserved the right to request additional time if initial sessions proved insufficient.
"I'll prepare a schedule for your office this evening. For tomorrow's first sitting, I'll need you in formal evening dress. Tradition dictates dukes be portrayed in full ceremonial attire, regardless of personal preference. Do you have a particular coat you favor, or should I plan composition around whatever you choose?" The question was purely practical, focused on portrait logistics rather than his comfort, and Sebastian appreciated the businesslike approach, even as he found himself slightly unsettled by how thoroughly she seemed to have taken control. He agreed to arrive in appropriate attire and assured her he'd select something suitable, mind already cataloging which evening coat would work best, probably the black superfine with silver buttons and minimal ornamentation, nothing drawing additional attention. Eliza nodded, satisfied, then did something unexpected. She extended her hand to shake, a gesture technically inappropriate for a woman to initiate with a man of his rank, but which felt entirely natural in their professional negotiations context. Sebastian hesitated fractionally, caught off guard by the casual protocol breach, then took her hand. Her palm was warm, grip firm and confident, and she met his eyes directly as they shook, expression suggesting she considered this partnership between equals rather than arrangement between aristocratic patron and hired artist.
Her hand was warm, her grip steady, and she held contact for normal duration, not pulling away quickly as though contact with damaged skin was something to minimize, not holding on too long in performative demonstration of unbotheredness. Just a normal handshake, the kind of professional courtesy meaning nothing in any other context, but feeling oddly significant because voluntary touching was so rare. "I'll see you tomorrow morning, Your Grace," she said, releasing his hand and turning back to her supplies. 8 o'clock sharp. Try for good sleep. Portrait sittings are more exhausting than most expect, and I need you alert enough to maintain good posture for 3 hours. The dismissal was clear but felt friendly rather than rude, as though she offered professional advice to a colleague rather than dismissing her employer. Sebastian left the gallery with the strangest sensations settling in his chest. Not quite curiosity, not quite anticipation, but something in that territory he hadn't felt in years about any human interaction. That night, alone in his chambers, Sebastian opened the small wooden box where he kept precious possessions, items too valuable to risk casual viewing or servant questions. Among them, faded and fragile after 18 years, was a pale blue ribbon a little girl had given him at a garden party when they were both children. He held it carefully, running scarred fingers over silk grown soft with age, and wondered if he was going mad to think there was something familiar about Eliza Hartwell, beyond the simple fact that fearless directness was rare enough to stand out in anyone. Her name meant nothing. Hartwell could be any of 100 minor gentry families, and it was absurd to imagine that little girl would have become an artist who traveled to remote estates, treating scarred dukes with matter-of-fact professionalism. That little girl would have learned better by now, would have absorbed her mother's lessons about appropriate associations, would have married someone suitable, and lived the conventional life her upbringing prepared her for. But still something nagged, something in Eliza Hartwell's direct gaze and fearless approach, reminding him of a 6-year-old who'd walked up to him like scars didn't matter, who'd given him ribbon and promised to marry him without understanding such promises weren't meant to be kept. Sebastian put the ribbon away and tried to sleep, mind refusing to quiet. Thoughts circling between strategic assessment of upcoming portrait sessions and something more dangerous, feeling uncomfortably like hope. Morning arrived with that particular quality of light that makes everything feel both inevitable and uncertain. Sebastian dressed with more attention than usual, selecting the black superfine and managing his cravat through 2 attempts before achieving appropriate formality. The mirror provided its customary assessment, tissue damage mapping the left side of his face from temple to collarbone, jaw alignment slightly off where bone had mended imperfectly, the puckered scarring around his eye that gave his features permanent asymmetry. 18 years post-fire, and medical professionals still occasionally proposed new procedures, never quite stating aloud they might render him less frightening to children and respectable women. He arrived at precisely 8 o'clock to find Eliza already working,
easel positioned to capture optimal morning illumination, supplies organized with the precision of military logistics. She glanced up as he entered, and Sebastian prepared for that first full-light reaction to his formal appearance. But her expression merely registered professional approval.
"Excellent choice," she said, gesturing toward a chair positioned near the window. "The fabric quality is superb. The cut classic enough to avoid dating the portrait to any specific year. Come, I need to adjust positioning for how the light falls." She directed him with casual authority that suggested she'd either forgotten or simply didn't care about the vast social gulf between Duke and hired artist. Hands reaching out to adjust his shoulder angle or chin set with touches that were professional, impersonal, but completely unself-conscious about contact. Sebastian sat where instructed, body assuming rigid formal posture automatically, spine straight, shoulders back, bearing suggesting military discipline he'd never actually received. Eliza circled slowly, studying how morning light caught his features from various angles, occasionally reaching out for minute adjustments. Her fingers were warm where they brushed fabric and occasionally skin. Sebastian held very still, hyper-aware of each contact point, in ways feeling absurd given how impersonal and professionally focused her touches were. Eliza murmured, half to herself, stepping back to assess overall composition with narrowed eyes. She pulled a notebook from her apron, began making rapid sketches. Sebastian's breathing stuttered, waiting for clarification that she meant this euphemistically, some artistic language translating to, "We'll make the best of unfortunate circumstances," without stating it directly. But no clarification came. She simply continued studying him with focused intensity, occasionally noting observations he couldn't see from his position. The silence settling over the gallery held unexpected comfort, broken only by charcoal scratching canvas and Eliza's occasional soft sounds of consideration. Sebastian started, uncertain how to finish without revealing vulnerability, feeling strategically unwise. Better? Whole? Less like something that prompted mothers to grab their daughters. Eliza glanced up from her notebook, one eyebrow raised in genuine query. She asked, setting down her pencil and moving closer until he could smell faint linseed oil and turpentine clinging to her clothing, could see paint residue on her fingers and intensity blazing in dark eyes as she waited for him to finish. That teasing note threaded her voice again, gentle mockery somehow managing to feel friendly rather than cruel, as though inviting him to laugh at the suggestion's absurdity rather than mocking his actual appearance. "Most people find my appearance problematic," Sebastian said carefully, each word chosen with deliberate precision, because this conversation felt dangerous in ways he couldn't articulate. He maintained neutral tone, discussing his face as purely practical problem rather than something shaping every adult interaction. But even he could hear the tension underneath careful control. Eliza tilted her head, considering this with what appeared to be genuine thought rather than automatic dismissal. She moved even closer, within arm's reach now, and lifted one hand slowly toward his face. Sebastian tensed instinctively because people didn't touch his scars voluntarily, didn't reach toward damaged tissue unless medical necessity drove the contact. But Eliza's hand didn't falter. Her fingers came to rest gently against the worst scarring on his left cheek, tracing ridged tissue with light pressure, suggesting careful study rather than revulsion. "Your face tells a narrative," she said quietly, eyes focused where her fingers touched scarred skin, no hint of discomfort in her expression. "Fire, survival, years living with trauma's aftermath. Pain you survived when death was possible, healing imperfect but sufficient to preserve life. That's infinitely more compelling than generic aristocratic handsomeness, which honestly becomes indistinguishable after you've painted enough of it."
Her fingers moved slightly, following scarring patterns down toward his jaw.
Sebastian couldn't breathe, couldn't move, couldn't process what was happening beyond the simple fact that someone was voluntarily touching his face, studying his scars with focused interest, rather than poorly concealed horror. Eliza continued, voice matter-of-fact despite the contact's intimacy, fingers still resting against damaged skin, like the scarring warranted study rather than avoidance. I'm interested in capturing truth, which means painting exactly what I observe. A man who survived something catastrophic and carries evidence of it, yes, but who is clearly intelligent, clearly powerful, clearly more complex than whatever surface impression his appearance might initially create. She met his eyes directly, hand still cradling his scarred cheek with gentleness, making something fracture in his chest. Unless you'd prefer standard aristocratic portrait treatment, soft focus, strategic lighting,
All the typical tricks creating flattering but ultimately dishonest images that reduce you to just another interchangeable noble face. I can do that if you insist, Your Grace, but it would waste both our time and be significantly less interesting to observe for the next 100 years. Sebastian stared at her, something fundamental shifting in how he was processing this entire interaction. No one had ever described his scars as compelling. No one had ever touched them this way, with careful study and zero hint of the revulsion usually accompanying any acknowledgement of his appearance. No one had ever suggested honesty about what he looked like might produce something worth creating, rather than something requiring apology. Eliza held his gaze steadily, hand still against his face, clearly awaiting his response but equally prepared to paint whatever version he requested, even if she found conventional approach less engaging.
"Paint what you see," Sebastian said, voice rougher than intended, something raw bleeding through despite usual careful control.
Paint truth. He struggled, finding words adequate to what he was attempting to express. I'm exhausted from pretending the fire didn't happen. Exhausted from other people's discomfort dictating how I'm permitted to exist. If you can create something honest, something that doesn't apologize for what I look like, then yes, do that. The words emerged almost fierce, years of suppressed frustration and anger at being treated like tragedy or monster, finally finding voice. Eliza smiled, real smile reaching her eyes and transforming her entire face into something radiant. Good, she said simply, hand finally leaving his face as she stepped back toward her easel. Truth makes for better art anyway. And honestly, Your Grace, you have excellent bone structure beneath the scarring. Strong jaw, good proportions. The kind of aristocratic features painters dream about. The scars don't detract from that. They simply add visual complexity. She picked up charcoal and turned to canvas, entire focus shifting to work now that they'd established approach. Sebastian found himself almost laughing at that characterization. Something about her blunt directness cutting through years of careful self-protection in ways that should feel threatening but somehow didn't. He consciously relaxed his shoulders, let posture settle into something more natural. Watched as Eliza's hand began moving across canvas with confident strokes. The first sitting stretched into nearly 4 hours before Eliza finally announced she had what she needed for initial sketch work. Sebastian was surprised, discovering time had passed, with none of the excruciating discomfort he'd anticipated. Sitting still while someone studied his face minutely should have been torturous. But somehow Eliza's presence across the room had been almost peaceful, her focus intense, but not oppressive. When she gave permission to move, Sebastian stood and stretched, then found himself drawn to the easel, where he could observe what she'd been creating. The sketch remained rough, all gesture and suggestion rather than finished detail. But even in preliminary state, he could see what she'd meant about capturing truth. The face looking back from canvas was unmistakably his, scarred, asymmetrical, marked by fire in ways no artistic license could disguise. But something in how she'd captured his jaw's angle, his shoulders set, the expression in his eyes suggested strength rather than tragedy, power rather than victimhood. "You're rendering me," he started, then stopped. Eliza came to stand beside him, wiping charcoal dust from hands onto a well-used rag, studying her own work with critical assessment. "I'm rendering you like yourself," she said firmly, tone brooking no argument. "Like a man who survived something catastrophic and chose to keep living despite it, who built power and influence in a world that tried to dismiss him as pitiable. That's not flattery, Your Grace. That's simply what I observe when I look at you, what anyone would see if they bothered looking past their own discomfort long enough to actually pay attention." She paused, glancing at him sideways with an expression that might have been amusement. "Though I suppose if you'd prefer the tragic wounded hero interpretation most society painters would apply, I could adjust approach. Tilt your head down slightly, get some dramatic shadow work happening, really lean into the tortured soul aesthetic that sells so well in London galleries." Sebastian found himself laughing, actually laughing, the sound startling him with its spontaneity. "I think we'll skip the tortured soul aesthetic," he managed. "As you said, truth is more compelling than performance." Over the following days, a pattern emerged. Sebastian would arrive at 8 o'clock each morning, settle into the appointed chair while Eliza adjusted lighting and positioning with casual touches he was beginning to anticipate rather than brace against. And then they would work in companionable silence, broken by occasional conversation, ranging from purely professional observations to increasingly personal discussions. Eliza asked about his childhood before the fire, about his brothers, about how he'd learned managing vast estates when he'd never expected to inherit. She asked about his education, his interests, whether he ever regretted the isolation he'd chosen, or if it genuinely felt preferable to alternative society engagement. Sebastian found himself answering with honesty he'd never managed in other social situations. Perhaps because she asked while focused on her canvas, rather than looking directly at him. The slight distance, creating space for vulnerability that direct eye contact would have made impossible. He told her about the fire, waking trapped in burning nursery, terror of finding no escape through smoke and flames, pain of burns and subsequent surgeries, slow realization his face would never heal in ways making other people comfortable. He told her about isolation that followed, gradual withdrawal from anything approximating normal social interaction, learning to read people's discomfort in subtle eye-widening or slight backward steps.
But he also told her about power he'd built from that isolation, learning to use people's fear as strategic advantage, becoming so effective at estate management and investment that his father had quietly shifted increasing responsibility onto his shoulders, despite social embarrassment of having Sebastian interact with business partners. He told her about his brother's deaths and unwanted inheritance, about strange relief of finally having absolute authority over his own life, even if it came with responsibilities he'd never wanted. Eliza listened while she painted, occasionally asking clarifying questions, but mostly just letting him talk. And she reciprocated with her own stories, growing up in households valuing propriety above nearly everything, discovering artistic talent young, and her family's horror at the idea of their daughter pursuing something as scandalously bohemian as professional painting. Her mother, she mentioned casually one morning, had very specific ideas about appropriate behavior and associations, ideas causing increasingly severe conflict as Eliza grew older and refused conforming to expectations. Something about how she said this triggered memory in Sebastian, vague but insistent. He asked carefully whether her family was from this region,
whether they might have attended social events at estates like Hartley Manor in the 1830s. Eliza's hand stilled on her brush for a barely perceptible moment before resuming confident strokes. "Yes," she said after a pause, feeling slightly extended, voice carefully neutral in ways suggesting deliberate word choice. "My family knew the Hartley family.
Attended events there occasionally when I was very young. My mother eventually cut those ties over some social disagreement I was too young to fully understand." She glanced up from her painting, meeting his eyes with an expression he couldn't quite read. Sebastian's pulse accelerated in ways feeling ridiculous given the question's simplicity. But something in her careful neutrality and slight pause before answering was triggering every instinct he'd developed for reading people and detecting when they were concealing something significant. "I attended a garden party at Hartley Manor when I was 10, he said slowly, watching her face for any reaction, any sign this information meant something to her. "Shortly after the fire. It was among the last social events I attended as a child, before withdrawing from society entirely. There was a little girl there who—" He trailed off, suddenly uncertain how to continue, without revealing he'd kept a ribbon for 18 years, because a child had been kind once before learning better. The gallery had gone profoundly quiet, Eliza's brush hovering motionless over canvas, her entire body gone still in ways suggesting she'd stopped breathing. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, almost hesitant in a way completely unlike her usual confident directness. "Quote 56, she said, words coming out carefully, each one weighted with significance he was only beginning to process. She set down her brush with deliberate care, hands trembling slightly as she turned to face him fully. Sebastian saw recognition blazing in her dark eyes. Not vague familiarity he'd been sensing, but absolute certainty. Knowledge that had been there from the moment she'd first seen him in this gallery and had been carefully hidden behind professional composure. Eliza continued, voice gaining strength as she abandoned whatever pretense she'd been maintaining. "Told me never to go near you again. Used terrible words I didn't fully understand then, but understood perfectly well later when I was old enough to recognize cruelty disguised as propriety. I cried the entire way home because I didn't understand why kindness was wrong, why trying to help someone hurting was something warranting punishment." Sebastian couldn't breathe. The gallery felt simultaneously too small and too vast, reality rearranging itself around this revelation, changing everything about the past week, and potentially everything about his entire understanding of why this woman was here. He managed, voice barely above whisper, something between accusation and wonder bleeding through careful control he usually maintained. Eliza nodded slowly, composure finally cracking to reveal vulnerability and uncertainty underneath professional confidence she'd been projecting. "I've been looking for you for years," she admitted, words tumbling out now that the secret was revealed. "I didn't know your name then. You were just the boy from the garden party, the one my mother said I should forget about. But I couldn't forget. I tried finding out who you were, asked everyone who might remember that day, searched through social registers and estate records when I was old enough to understand how to access them." She took a breath, steadying herself. "When I finally learned you were the youngest Winterbourne son, that you'd inherited unexpectedly after your brothers died, that you'd essentially disappeared from society." She paused. "I engineered the commission with the Historical Society, convinced them Winterbourne Hall needed urgent documentation, that it was a preservation priority that couldn't wait. I've been planning this for months, working up courage to actually come here and face you, and discover if you remembered me at all, or if I'd built some childhood encounter into something far more significant than it actually was." The silence following this confession stretched between them, heavy with implications and questions, and fundamental reorganization of everything Sebastian had believed about this situation.
She'd been looking for him for years. Despite her mother's horror and condemnation, despite social cost of associating with someone like him, despite having every reason to simply forget about a childhood encounter that had meant nothing to anyone, except apparently both of them,
she'd deliberately sought him out, had maneuvered her way into his home under professional pretenses, had spent days painting his portrait while knowing exactly who he was, and apparently not caring about scars making most people uncomfortable. Sebastian said finally, the admission feeling both inadequate and essential, the only response he could form matching the magnitude of what she'd just revealed. All these years, I kept it because... He struggled finding words that wouldn't expose too much vulnerability. He stood from the chair, needing movement, needing to process this revelation through physical action. He asked, the question encompassing everything. Why search for him? Why come here? Why risk reputation and career on someone society had written off as unmarriageable and undesirable? Why spend years pursuing a childhood memory any reasonable person would have dismissed? Eliza moved toward him slowly, cautiously,
as though approaching something fragile that might shatter with sudden movement. She said simply, stopping close enough that he could see paint stains on her fingers and intensity in her dark eyes and absolute conviction in her expression. She laughed, but it sounded shaky, uncertain, vulnerable in ways her usual confidence had hidden. Sebastian said, less question than statement of obvious fact. Eliza shook her head, closing remaining distance until she stood near enough that he could feel warmth radiating from her body, could see her chest rising and falling with rapid breathing, suggesting she was as affected by this moment as he was. She confirmed, voice steady, despite vulnerability in her eyes. She reached out slowly, giving him time to pull away if he wanted, and took his hand in both of hers, fingers warm and solid and real against his scarred palm. Sebastian looked down at their joined hands, at the contrast between her smooth skin and his scarred flesh, felt something fundamental cracking in his chest, some carefully maintained barrier against hope, finally surrendering under weight of her words and presence, and simple fact that she was here, that she'd searched for him, that she'd kept a promise made in childhood when every reasonable person would have abandoned it years ago. He said, needing her to understand the full implications of what she was suggesting. He struggled for words adequate to the enormity. Eliza said calmly, fingers tightening around his hand, gaze steady and unflinching, despite magnitude of what they were discussing. Her voice hardened slightly, anger bleeding through. She released one of his hands to reach up and cup his scarred cheek, same gesture she'd made during their first portrait session, but weighted now with entirely different meaning. No longer professional assessment, but personal acceptance, and something looking dangerously like affection. I wanted to be someone who kept promises, she said softly. Someone who chose compassion over convenience, connection over social approval. Someone who believed the truest things we say are often the things we say before the world teaches us to be careful. I was 6 years old, and I looked at you, and I saw someone worth promising forever to. And 18 years of experience haven't changed that fundamental assessment. Sebastian pulled her closer, abandoning all pretense of appropriate social distance, his free hand coming up to cover hers where it rested against his scarred cheek.
I don't know how to do this,
he admitted, voice wrecked with emotion he'd spent years suppressing. Eliza said, rising on her toes to eliminate remaining distance between them, face tilted up toward his in clear invitation. Sebastian answered by kissing her, pouring 18 years of loneliness and desperate longing into the connection. Eliza kissed him back with equal intensity, arms wrapping around his neck to pull him closer. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Sebastian rested his forehead against hers. He said fiercely. Eliza smiled, radiant expression making his chest ache. She said with fierce certainty. The next several days passed in a blur of portrait sessions that became increasingly less about painting and more about learning each other. The work continued. Eliza was too professional to abandon her commission, but everything had changed between them. Then Lord Ashford arrived. Sebastian's estate manager, Harrison, appeared in his study one morning with news that a Lord Ashford had requested accommodation for business discussions. Sebastian had no memory of approving this. It had been handled by secretaries as routine courtesy.
Minor nobility frequently sought meetings with the Duke of Winterbourne for investment discussions, and Sebastian's policy was to accommodate reasonable requests when schedule permitted. Sebastian asked. Harrison consulted the letter. 2 weeks. 2 weeks of having another aristocrat in residence, when all Sebastian wanted was to continue exploring whatever was developing with Eliza. He considered refusing, but that would generate questions and speculation, potentially more troublesome than simply enduring Ashford's presence. Fine, Sebastian said curtly. East Wing guest suites, nowhere near the gallery or West Wing. Assign him a servant. Make clear dinner is the only meal where my presence is expected. That evening at dinner, Sebastian encountered Lord Ashford, approximately 30 years old, conventionally handsome in that generic way characterizing most nobility, expensive clothing fitting perfectly. He stood when Sebastian entered, offering a bow that was technically appropriate, but somehow conveyed condescension. "Your Grace," Ashford said smoothly, "I cannot thank you enough for your hospitality. I've heard remarkable things about your estate management." They sat down to dinner, and Sebastian endured small talk about London society and business trends, answering with minimal engagement. It wasn't until second course that Ashford shifted topics in ways immediately sharpening Sebastian's attention. "I understand you have an artist in residence," Ashford said casually. "Miss Hartwell, I believe. I encountered her this afternoon in the gallery. Remarkably talented for someone so young. And quite beautiful, if I may say so." The way he said this last part, the slight smirk accompanying it, made Sebastian's hands clench around silverware. With enough force, he had to consciously relax his grip. Sebastian said, voice cold enough to freeze water. Ashford raised hands in mock surrender, expression suggesting he found Sebastian's reaction amusing. "Of course, I meant no disrespect. Simply making an observation. I was actually hoping you might introduce us properly. I'd be very interested in discussing her work, perhaps commissioning a piece for my own estate." The request was phrased politely enough, but something in Ashford's tone suggested his interest in Eliza went beyond professional appreciation. Sebastian felt possessiveness surge through him in ways entirely new and slightly alarming in their intensity. Sebastian said flatly. It was a dismissal, clear and unambiguous, but Ashford simply smiled and changed subjects as though Sebastian hadn't just made his position clear. When Sebastian found Eliza in the gallery later that evening, he wasted no time. "We have a guest," he said without preamble. "Lord Ashford. He's staying 2 weeks, supposedly for business, but he's already made comments about you, suggesting his interests extend beyond professional appreciation of your artistic talents." Eliza's eyebrows rose, but she looked more amused than concerned. She asked teasingly. Sebastian said, the words coming out rougher and more possessive than intended. He stopped abruptly, realizing he was revealing far more vulnerability than strategic. Eliza confirmed, rising to kiss him softly. Sebastian pulled her closer, arms wrapping around her with perhaps more force than strictly necessary. He said, certainty settling cold in his gut.
Eliza pulled back just enough to look at him directly, hands framing his face. She said firmly. She kissed him again, harder this time, almost fierce. She said when they broke apart, Sebastian actually growled, a sound surprising both of them, and kissed her again. Over the following week, Ashford seemed to be everywhere Eliza was, appearing in the gallery to watch her work, encountering her in gardens when she was sketching, finding excuses to request her professional opinion on artwork. Each interaction was technically appropriate, but the cumulative effect was clear. Ashford was pursuing Eliza with confident persistence. Eliza maintained professional courtesy without encouraging his interest, but she was too kind to be overtly rude. Sebastian watched these interactions with growing frustration, mind running through increasingly violent scenarios about what he'd like to do to Ashford if social convention didn't constrain his options. The situation reached crisis one afternoon when Sebastian returned from an estate meeting to find Ashford and Eliza in the garden together, walking along manicured paths. As Sebastian watched from the terrace, Ashford reached out to touch Eliza's arm, contact lasting several seconds longer than necessary. Something snapped in Sebastian's control. He crossed the terrace and descended into the garden with long strides. Expression settled into what his business rivals called his negotiation face. Blank, cold, absolutely devoid of mercy. Sebastian said, voice carrying that particular edge making grown men reconsider their choices. Phrased as suggestion, but delivered as command. Dismissal clear and unambiguous. Ashford was finally smart enough to recognize when he was being removed, without room for negotiation. Ashford said, hand dropping from Eliza's arm, Miss Hartwell, perhaps we can continue our conversation at dinner this evening? He departed without waiting for response, and Sebastian waited until he was out of earshot before turning full attention to Eliza.
He was touching you, Sebastian said, words rough and possessive. Standing too close and touching you and looking at you like... Eliza stepped closer, taking his clenched hands in hers. Like he had a chance. She finished for him softly. Which he doesn't. I know what Ashford is doing. Testing you. Seeing if you'll actually fight for what you want. And I know you're struggling with jealousy you've never had to manage before, because you've never had anyone you wanted to claim as yours. She was right. Sebastian had never experienced jealousy because he'd never had anything he cared enough about to feel possessive toward. But now he had Eliza, and the thought of losing her to someone like Ashford was making him insane with protective fury. Sebastian admitted. Eliza's smile was fierce, approving. Good, she said simply. I didn't fall in love with a victim. I fell in love with a survivor who built an empire, who commands respect through brilliance, who is powerful enough to destroy anyone who threatens what he cares about. So if you want to destroy Ashford, do it. Show him exactly why the Duke of Winterbourne shouldn't be underestimated. Something fierce surged through Sebastian at her words, at the casual way she'd said, quote, 132, as though it was accepted fact. He pulled her into his arms and kissed her, with all the pent-up frustration and desire he'd been suppressing. When they finally broke apart, Sebastian rested his forehead against hers. Marry me, he said, the words command rather than question. Not someday when it's convenient. Soon, as soon as it can be arranged. I want you legally bound to me where no one can question it, where men like Ashford can see my ring on your finger and know without doubt that you're taken. Eliza pulled back just enough to meet his eyes. Are you sure? She asked quietly. Marriage means society will judge you for choosing someone they consider inappropriate. You could have anyone, Sebastian, anyone appropriate who would strengthen alliances. Instead, you're choosing me. and that choice will have consequences. I don't want anyone, Sebastian said fiercely, hands framing her face. I want you. I've wanted you since I was 10 years old, and you gave me a ribbon and looked at me like I deserved kindness. So yes, I'm sure. Marry me, Eliza. Let me claim you publicly and permanently. Let me show Ashford and everyone else that you're mine and I'm yours, and no amount of conventional attractiveness will change that. Yes, Eliza said, voice breaking slightly with emotion. Yes, I'll marry you. I've been planning to marry you since I was 6 years old. I'm just glad you finally caught up to the idea. That evening at dinner, Sebastian made the announcement with cold satisfaction, watching Ashford's face as he stated flatly that Miss Hartwell had agreed to become his duchess, that they would be married within the month. Ashford's expression shifted through surprise, calculation, resignation, finally settling on a smile that seemed genuine, despite underlying disappointment. He raised his glass in toast, offering congratulations, and Sebastian accepted the gesture with minimal grace. But the real test came 3 weeks later, when invitations arrived for a major London ball.
Eliza convinced Sebastian to attend as their first public appearance as an engaged couple. The ball was everything Sebastian had spent years avoiding. Crowded, socially complex, full of people who would stare and whisper. But it was also an opportunity to claim Eliza publicly. They arrived fashionably late, Sebastian in formal evening dress, and Eliza in midnight blue silk that made her look like a Renaissance painting. Sebastian kept her close, one hand possessively at the small of her back, expressions settled into cold, aristocratic hauteur, warning anyone thinking about making comments to reconsider. The evening proceeded with predictable social maneuvering, people approaching with congratulations, ranging from genuine to obviously forced, conversations skirting carefully around their unusual engagement. Sebastian endured it with minimal patience, attention primarily on Eliza, ensuring she was comfortable. Halfway through the evening, the situation Sebastian had been dreading materialized. Eliza's mother appeared across the ballroom, face going pale, then flushed with fury as she registered her daughter's presence and the Duke standing possessively beside her. Mrs. Hartwell crossed the ballroom with purpose, stopping directly in front of them, ignoring Sebastian entirely to focus on her daughter with intensity that would have been intimidating if Eliza hadn't spent 18 years preparing for this confrontation. Mrs. Hartwell said, voice low and tight. Command, not request. Maternal authority that had probably worked when Eliza was 6, but held no power over a woman in her mid-20s who'd already made her choices. Anything you need to say to me can be said here, Mother, Eliza replied steadily. In front of my fiancé. The word hung in the air, confirmation and challenge. Mrs. Hartwell's expression shifted into something between horror and rage as she finally acknowledged Sebastian's presence, gaze traveling over his scarred face with the same revulsion she'd shown 18 years ago. Mrs. Hartwell said, voice rising despite obvious attempt at control. She stopped, struggling to articulate what she thought Eliza was throwing away. Sebastian felt cold fury building, but Eliza squeezed his hand, silent request to let her handle this. Eliza said quietly, but her voice carried across the ballroom with perfect clarity. She took a breath. Mrs. Hartwell's face had gone from flushed to pale. You're making a mistake, she said, volume dropping, though fury underneath remained audible. When you realize what you've done, when the reality of being married to him becomes clear, don't expect sympathy from your family. Sebastian had heard enough. He stepped forward, positioning himself between Eliza and her mother. and when he spoke, his voice carried across the ballroom with cold, aristocratic authority, silencing nearby conversations. "Madam," he said, each word precisely enunciated, "you will remove yourself from my presence immediately. You will not approach my fiancée again this evening or at any point in the future. You will not contact her, write to her, or make any attempt to interfere with her choices. Is that clear?" Mrs. Hartwell stared at him, expression shifting between shock and outrage. "You cannot possibly think you have authority to—" "I am the Duke of Winterbourne," he said quietly, but with absolute conviction. "My wealth could buy your family's estate 10 times over without noticing the expenditure. My political influence extends to the crown itself. And you, madam, are the woman who taught a 6-year-old that kindness deserved punishment, who spent 18 years trying to destroy the best instincts your daughter possessed." The ballroom had gone completely silent, hundreds of guests watching with rapt attention.
"Your daughter is going to be my duchess. She will have wealth and position most women in this room can only dream of. And you will have nothing. No connection to power, no claim on her time, no ability to interfere with her happiness." He paused, letting the full weight of his position settle. "If I hear you have made any attempt to contact her, to question her judgment, to suggest she has made a mistake, I will ensure your family's social standing collapses so thoroughly you will be unable to secure invitations to any event of consequence for the remainder of your lives. I will use every political connection and financial resource at my disposal to make you regret the day you decided compassion was conditional. Do we understand each other?" Mrs. Hartwell's face had gone white, hands trembling as she processed the absolute sincerity of the threat. Around them, the ballroom remained silent, guests exchanging glances ranging from shock to approval as they reassessed the reclusive Duke and his capacity for ruthless social warfare. Mrs. Hartwell managed a stiff nod, unable to form words. Sebastian dismissed her with a gesture, watching with cold satisfaction as she retreated through the crowd with rigid shoulders, despite obvious humiliation. The silence broke into whispered conversation, speculation spreading like wildfire as guests processed what they'd just witnessed. Sebastian ignored them all, attention focused entirely on Eliza. But Eliza was looking at him with such fierce pride and obvious affection that any concerns about his approach dissolved. She rose on her toes and kissed him right there in the middle of the ballroom, with hundreds of witnesses watching. The ballroom erupted into a mixture of scandalized gasps and approving applause. They left shortly after, having achieved exactly what they'd come for: public claiming of their engagement, absolute demonstration that the Duke would tolerate no interference. The carriage ride back was quiet until Eliza finally broke silence with soft laughter. She said, settling against his side. Sebastian wrapped his arm around her. He said quietly. Eliza said simply, tilting her head up to kiss his jaw. They married 3 weeks later in Winterbourne Hall's private chapel, with only loyal staff and a few of Eliza's artist friends who'd proven themselves worthy by accepting the engagement without judgment. The ceremony was simple and perfect, traditional vows exchanged with absolute sincerity. When the priest pronounced them married, and Sebastian kissed his duchess for the first time with that legal claim attached, he felt something fundamental shift in his understanding of what his life could be. They settled into married life with surprising ease, Eliza establishing her studio and continuing her artistic work with Sebastian's complete support. Her talent flourished with access to resources, her reputation growing as collectors competed for her work. Sebastian learned to tolerate social interaction when it served Eliza's interests, learned to leverage his position to advance her career,
learned to stand beside her at gallery openings with possessive pride rather than defensive isolation. Years later, when people asked about their unusual courtship, Eliza would tell the truth, that she'd made a promise at 6 years old and kept it at 24. That the best love stories required patience and persistence and courage to believe childhood promises deserved honoring even when the world insisted otherwise. Sebastian would add little to these stories, content to let Eliza shape their narrative. But occasionally he'd meet her eyes across a crowded room and remember that moment in the garden when a small girl pushed a ribbon into his hand and promised to marry him. He'd remember thinking it was impossible, that eventually she'd learn better. And he'd feel grateful he'd been wrong, that some promises survived, that sometimes love worked exactly the way children believed it did before the world taught them otherwise. The blue ribbon remained in that wooden box, faded but treasured.
And on their first anniversary, Eliza gave him another ribbon, white silk, pristine and new, with a note. For the next 18 years, and all the years after that. Sebastian kept both ribbons together, twin symbols of promises kept and futures chosen despite every obstacle that should have kept them apart. Every time he looked at them, he was reminded that the truest things are often the things we say before the world teaches us to be careful, and that sometimes the greatest love stories begin with a 6-year-old girl and a scarred boy, and the absolute conviction that kindness is always worth offering, promises are always worth keeping, and love can survive anything if both people choose each other with eyes wide open and hearts fully committed.
So, what did you think of Sebastian and Eliza's journey? A promise made at 6 years old, kept for 18 years, and finally fulfilled against every obstacle society could throw at them. If this story reminded you that some promises are worth keeping no matter how impossible they seem, hit that like button. Drop a comment telling me which moment hit you hardest. Was it the garden party? The ballroom confrontation? The moment she revealed she'd been searching for him all those years? And here's what I need you to understand. This is just one story. There are dozens more waiting for you on this channel. Dukes brought to their knees, childhood promises kept across decades, revenge served cold in London ballrooms, and women who refused to settle for anything less than the love they were promised. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because I post stories like this every week. Stories where love doesn't just happen, it conquers.
Stories where the most powerful men in England learn that some women are worth burning the world down for. Don't let this be the last time you feel this. There's another Duke waiting for you in the next video. And trust me, his story might destroy you even more than Sebastian's did. I'll see you in the next one. And remember, the best love stories are the ones where someone refuses to give up, no matter how many years it takes.